Chapter 1. Ancient Roots Bloom. You are playing a dangerous game, Astyia. The council will not see this as a gesture of peace. They will see it as a surrender to a ghost. The advisor's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the dressing chamber, but Astyia didn't turn around. He was focused on the heavy, gold-edged plating of his formal armor, ensuring the straps were tightened with a precision that left no room for slack. The metal was cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the midday sun filtering through the high windows. He liked the weight of it. It felt honest. It was a physical manifestation of the burden he had carried since the day his father was summoned to take the mantle of the house, a bridge between the pragmatic power of Astyia and the fatting, poetic dignity of Jeopardy. He stepped toward a polished silver mirror, his jaw setting as he caught his own reflection. He had his mother's features, the kind of symmetry that suggested a lineage of poets and scholars. But his eyes were those of a man who had spent his youth studying maps of ruined cities and the arithmetic of statecraft. He remembered the way his mother, Marza, used to speak of her grandfather Zados, her voice softening into a melody of exile and loss. Astyia had grown up in the corridors of Astyia, learning that a crown was less about the gold on one's head and more about the compromises one made in the dark. Across the castle, in a chamber scented with crushed lilies and beeswax, Princess Celilipa stood perfectly still while her attendants worked. Her dark hair had been coaxed into an intricate bun, a cascade of ringlets framing a face that looked as though it had been painted by a master of the 17th century. The silver gown she wore didn't just shimmer. It flowed around her like liquid moonlight, heavy with a weave that spoke of Riondol's legendary looms. She didn't fidget. She had been raised in the frescoed halls of the House of Savoy, where she learned early on that a princess's posture was her first line of defense. For Celilipa, this wedding was not just a fairy tale, but a delicate experiment in trust. She had spent years studying the poetry of diplomacy and the cold logic of power, understanding that the alliance between the Savoy and Conwyn houses was a fragile thread stretched across decades of suspicion. She didn't enter this marriage with the naive hope of a girl, but with the strategic calm of a woman who believed that peace was something to be engineered piece by piece through negotiation and patience. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral groaned open, releasing a torrent of incense and the roar of 1,000 expectant voices. As Astyia stepped into the aisle, the sound didn't hit him as a wave, but as a rhythmic pulse, like the beating of a great collective heart. He walked with a measured stride, the gold etching of his armor catching the sunlight that poured through the stained glass, casting long amethyst and crimson shadows across the white marble. He did not look at the councilmen lining the nave, men whose faces were etched with a curated skepticism, but kept his gaze fixed on the altar, where the promise of a new era waited to be signed in vows. Then she appeared. Celilipa descended the stairs with a grace that felt less like walking and more like a slow, inevitable tide. The silver of her gown seemed to absorb the light of the room, making her appear almost translucent against the vivid tapestries of the great hall. As she reached his side, their eyes met for a fleeting second. In that look, there was no bridal nervousness, only a silent, mutual recognition of the stakes. They were two architects standing before a blueprint of a city that had not yet been built, both aware that the foundation was laid on shifting sands. The ceremony was a masterpiece of choreography, a sequence of ancient rites designed to bind blood to blood and land to land. The high priest's voice droned in a melodic cadence, reciting the lineages of the Savoy and the Conwyns, weaving their histories together in a verbal tapestry. Alyson felt the weight of the ring as he slid it onto Celilippa's finger, a small, cold circle of gold that felt, in that moment, as heavy as a fortress wall. It was the official seal on a gamble that spanned 2 kingdoms. However, the perfection of the moment was a veil. High above the congregation, tucked into the velvet darkness of the gallery, 4 hooded figures watched in absolute silence. They were ghosts in the machinery of the celebration, guests who had bypassed the invitations to attend the funeral of an alliance they intended to kill. Among them stood Bladevina of Ponsonby. She did not clap when the couple was pronounced husband and wife. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes tracing the line of Alyson's throat. To her, the shimmering silver of the bride and the gold of the groom were not symbols of unity, but targets marked for a precise and calculated erasure. As the couple turned to face the crowd, Alyson felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cathedral. He glanced toward the shadows of the gallery, catching a glimpse of a dark hood retreating into the gloom. He realized it was Bladevina. As a member of the House of Ponsonby, he knew she was one of the people who disapproved of the marriage, but not the depth of the grudge she carried. But as he felt Celilippa's hand tighten instinctively around his own, he realized that the wedding was not the end of their struggle. It was merely the opening gambit. The applause of the nobility sounded to his ears like the distant crashing of a storm. And for the first time, he wondered if the bridge he had spent his life building was strong enough to withstand the coming flood. As the couple turned to face the crowd, Alyson felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cathedral. He glanced toward the shadows of the gallery, catching a glimpse of a dark hood retreating into the gloom. He realized it was Bladevina. As a member of the House of Ponsonby, he knew she was one of the people who disapproved of the marriage, but not the depth of the grudge she carried. But as he felt Celilippa's hand tighten instinctively around his own, he realized that the wedding was not the end of their struggle. It was merely the opening gambit. The applause of the nobility sounded to his ears like the distant crashing of a storm. And for the first time, he wondered if the bridge he had spent his life building was strong enough to withstand the coming flood. However, as he turned to look at his wife and queen, he knew whatever storm that was coming, he would still stand together. Years earlier, Celilipa uncle's appointment as Viceroy of Floria brought her mother and siblings to join him in Baradil, the boundary lines of Floria, Brialfale and Astyia. The children were brought up in the strict and closed surroundings of a court that was both strict and mixed of different culture houses. Bladivina of Ponsonby, enemy of the House of Savoy, made sure the young princess's stay was cold and felt unwelcome. Often reminding her homeland was formerly one of the old nations that maintained their traditions after the fall of the old world, and betrayed an ally by severing ties, and to not expect any great union by being privileged to be in Baradil. At 13, Celilipa didn't attract much attention, except for the furtive glances of the visiting future King Alistan when he accompanied his father on a visit to the Baradil during their stay, searching for a wife who could help strengthen his political position, since there were still whispers about his mixed blood. They initially asked to marry one of the daughters of the House of Seals, but before a union could be arranged, the girl and those of the visiting house mysteriously died. No one knew Bladivina had any involvement in it. Not wanting to antagonize House of Conwyn, though, the head of Baradil offered them one of the daughters of either Savoy or Ponsonby. While a bride to a long old alley had its benefits, a bride of the Savoy House would provide the Conwyns with a powerful link to lost opportunities and import that was lost back in the days of the old world. Offering such an opportunity, the House of Conwyn accepted, considering this as a type of experiment to see if after centuries an old alliance from the old world could be regained in the new one. Remembering Celilipa, Astrian firmly refused the viceroy's first offer of his eldest niece, Isabetha. At first, his parents were against it, but soon gave in, and an agreement was made. And a large amount of money for Celilipa, along with a trade for precious oil and other imports lost back in the era of the old world, were added into her dowry. And now here they were, husband and wife, about to begin a life together as the new king and queen. The cake is a lie, though the icing is exquisite. The comment came from Alistan's younger cousin Julian, who was currently leaning against a marble pillar with a plate of honey-glazed pears, watching the royal couple navigate the gauntlet of cheering nobles. Alistan let out a short, genuine laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in hours. He stepped away from the fanfare for a moment, drawing Celilipa with him toward a recessed alcove of the great hall. Here, the noise of the celebration became a muffled hum, like the sound of a distant ocean, allowing them a few seconds of stolen privacy. Celilipa leaned her head against his armored shoulder, the silver fabric of her gown shimmering like a dying star in the dim light of the alcove. "You are shaking," she whispered, her voice a soft, grounding contrast to the chaos outside. "Not from fear," Alistan replied, though he didn't specify that it was from the adrenaline of knowing they were being hunted by ghosts. He looked down at her, noting the strategic precision with which she held herself, even in a moment of repose. I was thinking about Baradil, about how small we were when we first met, and how large the world has become since then. Celilippa smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. We were children playing at diplomacy, Alistan. Now we are adults playing sovereignty. The difference is that now, the stakes are no longer just the disapproval of a viceroy, but the stability of a kingdom. She reached up, straightening the gold collar of his armor with a gentle, proprietary touch. Bladivina is here. I saw her shadow in the gallery. She doesn't just want the alliance to fail. She wants us to prove that we are unworthy of the legacies we claim. All because you didn't choose her to be your wife. She doesn't just want us to fail, Alistan corrected softly, his voice deepening as he looked back toward the crowd. She wants to prove that the old world's hatreds are the only things that truly endure. To her, a bridge is just something to be burned. He felt the cold weight of the ring on his finger, a reminder that their union was not merely a romantic pact, but a structural necessity for the realm. He knew that for every guest who toasted their health, there was another in the hall, calculating the cost of their downfall. Celilippa stepped back, her gaze sweeping the room with the practiced eye of a general surveying a battlefield. She didn't see guests, she saw factions. There were the loyalists of Astyia, the skeptical lords of the borderlands, and the Ponsonby contingent, who huddled together like a pack of wolves in silk. The first few weeks will be the most perilous, she observed, her tone shifting into the strategic calm that had served her so well in Riondal. The council will wait for a crack, a disagreement over a tax, a slip in etiquette, a moment of public friction. That is when Bladivina will strike, turning a domestic spat into a political crisis. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Bladivina appeared at the edge of the dance floor, her presence cutting through the festivities like a blade. She was dressed in deep crimson and obsidian, a stark contrast to Celilippa's ethereal silver. She didn't approach them with a smile, but with a curated mask of polite indifference, her eyes scanning Alistan with a clinical precision that suggested she was looking for a flaw in his armor. A magnificent spectacle, she murmured, her voice honeyed yet hollow. One can almost believe that a few vows can erase a century of betrayal. Tell me, King Alistan, does the crown feel lighter when it is supported by a ghost's promise? Alistan didn't let the barb land. Instead, he tightened his grip on Celilippa's hand, projecting a unity that was as much a weapon as any sword. The crown feels exactly as it should, Lady Bladivina, he replied, his voice steady and resonant. Heavy enough to remind me of my duty, and strong enough to withstand the winds of opinion. We are grateful for the house of Ponsonby's attendants. The word attendants was a subtle reminder that they were guests in his house, subjects to his law, regardless of the grudge they harbored. For a heartbeat, a flicker of genuine irritation crossed Bladivina's face, a crack in the porcelain. She had expected the young king to be rattled, perhaps swayed by the lingering doubts of his mixed heritage. Instead, she found a man who had internalized the lessons of his mother's exile and turned them into a shield. She gave a shallow bow, her eyes lingering on Celilippa with a look of predatory curiosity. "Of course. Enjoy your honeymoon in the sunlight, your majesties. The shadows have a way of growing long as the day ends." The banquet that followed was a study in curated tension, a feast where the clinking of crystal sounded like the sharpening of knives. Alysston and Celilippa sat at the head of the long table, a bastion of gold and silver amidst a sea of competing colors. Every toast was a veiled interrogation. Every compliment from the councilmen felt like a probe for a weakness. Yet, as the night wore on, the couple found a rhythm. They spoke in a synchronized shorthand, Alysston handling the blunt inquiries of the military lords, while Celilippa navigated the labyrinthine grievances of the court ladies with a grace that left her detractors feeling outmaneuvered by their own politeness. In the quiet of the third hour, as the musicians transitioned into a slower, more melancholic melody, Alysston felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the space behind him. He didn't need to turn to know that the Ponsonby contingent was watching. He could feel Bladevina's gaze like a needle pressing against the nape of his neck. It was a psychological siege, an attempt to make him feel isolated even in a room full of his own subjects. He leaned closer to Celilippa, his voice a barely audible murmur. "She is waiting for us to retreat. She wants us to seek sanctuary in the private quarters, so the court can speculate on our discord." Celilippa didn't blink, her expression one of serene interest as she listened to a duchess describe the floral arrangements of the South. "Then we shall do the opposite," she replied, her voice like silk. "We will stay until the last candle gutters. We will be the most visible people in the room." With a subtle nod, she signaled the servants to bring forth the spiced wines of Riondol, a gesture of generosity that served as a reminder of the wealth and trade the Savoy alliance brought to the table. It was a strategic display of soft power, turning a moment of vulnerability into a demonstration of prosperity. The following week passed in a blur of administrative chaos and celebratory formality. Alysston spent his mornings in the war room, not studying battle plans, but auditing the ledgers of the House of Ponsonby. He had discovered a series of irregularities in the border taxes, small, bleeding wounds in the treasury that suggested Bladevina's house had been skimming from the crown for a decade. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he let the information simmer, a hidden card he could play when the time was right. He found a strange comfort in the paperwork. It was a different kind of armor, one that protected the kingdom's future by exposing its current rot. One evening, while walking through the moonlit gardens, Alysston found Celilippa staring at a withered rose bush, its stems black and brittle. She didn't turn as he approached, but her voice was steady. "The gardeners say this bush was planted by your grandfather, Zados. They told me it was thought dead for 20 years, until a single shoot appeared last spring." She finally turned to him, the moonlight casting her features in sharp, silver relief. "The council thinks we are a fragile experiment, Alysston. They think the old world is dead, and we are merely pretending to revive it. But some things don't die. They just wait for the right soil. The soil here is rocky, Celilipa, Alistan replied, stepping beside her. It takes more than a single shoot to reclaim a garden. He looked at her, seeing the strategic mind of the Savoy princess blending with the genuine hope of a woman who truly wanted a home. But the root is still there. That is what Bladivina fears. She doesn't fear the ghost of the old world, she fears its resurrection. Their moment of quiet was shattered by the arrival of a page, breathless and pale, who informed them that a delegation from the council had arrived unannounced at the gates. They hadn't come for a courtesy visit. They had come to demand an immediate audit of the wedding dowry, claiming that the lost imports promised by the House of Savoy were not reaching the treasury. It was a calculated strike, timed precisely for the moment the festivities ended and the exhaustion of the new couple began to set in. It was a classic Ponsonby maneuver. Cast doubt on the bride's generosity to undermine the groom's judgment. Alistan didn't let the irritation show. He felt a spark of kinship with the young man who had brought the news. Another pawn in a game he was only just beginning to master. "Tell the council we shall meet them in the solar at dawn," Alistan commanded, his voice regaining the resonance of a king. "And ensure that Lady Bladivina is invited to witness the proceedings. If they wish to discuss the accounts of Riondal, it would be a shame to leave the most vocal critic in the dark." As they walked back toward the keep, the atmosphere of the castle had shifted. The celebratory banners were beginning to fray in the autumn wind, and the laughter of the wedding guests had been replaced by the hushed, urgent whispers of courtiers. Celilipa walked with a renewed rigidity, her silver gown replaced by a structured dress of deep navy. She had already begun drafting a response to the council's accusations in her mind, treating the challenge not as an insult, but as a legal puzzle to be solved. The night was spent not in the luxury of their bridal suite, but in the dim light of the archives. Alistan and Celilipa sat side by side, surrounded by the scent of old parchment and ink, cross-referencing the trade manifests with the border ledgers he had been auditing. They found the discrepancy not in the Savoy imports, but in the transit hubs managed by the House of Ponsonby. The oil and silk hadn't failed to arrive. They had been diverted into private warehouses, the profits siphoned off by those who claimed the alliance was failing. The solar at dawn was colder than Alistan had expected, the morning mist clinging to the window panes like a damp shroud. The councilmen were already seated, their expressions a curated blend of concern and condescension. Bladivina sat among them, her crimson dress a vivid stain against the muted gray of the stone walls. She looked remarkably rested, her eyes bright with the anticipation of a victory she believed was inevitable. When Alistan entered, flanked by Celilipa, he didn't take his seat immediately. Instead, he leaned against the heavy oak table, sliding a stack of parchment across the polished surface toward the head of the council. "The audit is complete," Alistan announced, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "It appears the House of Savoy has been remarkably punctual with its imports. The oil, the silks, the rare spices, all arrived at the border exactly as the treaty specified. A ripple of confusion passed through the council. Bladevina's mask flickered, her brow knitting together as she glanced at the documents. And yet, she interjected, her voice a sharp, precise instrument, the treasury remains empty of these assets. Surely, the king is not suggesting the goods simply vanished into the ether. Celilipa stepped forward, her movements fluid and deliberate. She didn't look at the council. She looked directly at Bladevina. They didn't vanish, Lady Bladevina. They were merely redirected. Celilipa produced a second set of ledgers, the diverted transit logs Alistan had uncovered in the archives. It seems the House of Ponsonby has been acting as a most efficient filter, ensuring that the wealth of the old alliance reached your private warehouses rather than the royal coffers. A fascinating logistical feat, really. I didn't realize the Ponsonby estates had such a sudden and immense need for Riandalian oil. The silence that followed was absolute. The councilmen looked from the ledgers to Bladevina, their skepticism shifting into a sudden, frantic curiosity. In the high-stakes world of the court, a grudge was respectable, but theft from the crown was a liability. The power dynamic in the room shifted in a heartbeat. The fragile experiment of the marriage had suddenly produced a weapon of surprising potency. Bladevina did not flinch, but the stillness of her posture became brittle. She stared at the ledgers, as if she could incinerate the ink with a single glance, her mind racing to construct a plausible defense. A misunderstanding of logistics, she began, her voice regaining its honeyed composure, is hardly a crime of state. The diversion was a temporary measure to ensure the goods were not spoiled by the damp of the border forts. A temporary measure that lasted 3 fiscal quarters, Alistan countered, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with authority. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. The weight of the evidence on the table did the shouting for him. The border forts of Ponsonby are surprisingly well insulated. It seems so much so that they can store a king's ransom in oil without a single drop leaking into the royal treasury. The councilmen, sensing the wind shifting, began to mutter. The skepticism they had harbored for Alistan's bloodline was momentarily eclipsed by their appetite for a scandal that benefited the crown. They looked at Bladevina not as a peer, but as a potential source of reclaimed revenue. Celilipa watched this transition with a quiet, satisfied intensity. She knew that in the arithmetic of power, a stolen coin was a more potent weapon than 1,000 years of ancestral grievance. The House of Ponsonby will, of course, rectify this oversight immediately, Bladevina said, her eyes narrowing. She stood slowly, her crimson skirts whispering against the stone. We shall return the assets to the treasury with interest. However, let us not pretend that a few misplaced crates of oil prove the stability of this union. A house built on stolen ledgers is still a house of cards. Perhaps, Alistan replied, stepping closer to his wife, but it is a house that now knows exactly where its enemies keep their secrets. He gestured toward the door. You are dismissed, Lady Bladevina. I believe you have a great deal of inventory to reorganize. The aftermath of the solar meeting didn't bring the peace Alistan had hoped for, but rather a cold, humming silence that settled over the castle like a winter frost. For the first few days, the nobility treated the house of Ponsonby with a curated distance, a social quarantine that Bladevina navigated with a terrifyingly calm grace. She didn't retreat. Instead, she became a ghost in the corridors, her crimson dresses flashing briefly at the corners of hallways before she vanished into the servants' passages. She had been stripped of her financial leverage, but she had not been stripped of her intellect, and Alistan knew that a cornered predator is always the most dangerous. She is not mourning the loss of the oil, Celilipa observed one evening as they sat in the library, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the spines of Geogralian histories. She was nursing a cup of tea, her gaze fixed on the heavy oak door. She is calculating the cost of her desperation. You've taken her gold, Alistan, but you've left her with her spite. In our world, spite is a far more durable currency. Alistan looked up from a map of the eastern coast, the ink still damp on the borders he was redrawing. I would rather face her spite than her theft. At least spite is honest. He stood and walked toward his wife, placing a hand on her shoulder. The tension of the last few weeks had forged something between them that went beyond the strategic calm of their contract. It was a genuine, quiet kinship, born of the shared experience of being watched and judged by people who viewed them as experiments rather than humans. Their moment of respite was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic knocking at the door. It wasn't the herald's formal announcement, but the frantic rapping of Julian. When the young cousin burst into the room, his usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of genuine alarm. The western stables, Julian panted, his face flushed. There has been an incident. The horses from the Savoy shipment, the ones meant for the royal guard, they've been tainted. Alistan was on his feet in a heartbeat, the protective instinct of a king overriding the exhaustion of a husband. He and Celilipa hurried through the torchlit halls, the sound of their footsteps echoing like drumbeats. When they reached the stables, the air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and a bitter, metallic chemical. Several of the prized Riandalian stallions were shivering in their stalls, their eyes wide with a panicked, glassy look, though they remained standing. The royal veterinarian, a small man with spectacles that magnified his panicked eyes, was frantically scrubbing a residue of iridescent blue slime from the water troughs, a concentrated extract of nightshade and something. Alien, he sputtered, his voice trembling. Not enough to kill them, Your Majesty, but enough to render them mindless. These horses cannot be ridden. They are in a state of waking sleep. They will wander into a wall or a cliff if let loose. Alistan looked at the horses, the pride of Riandal, the living symbols of the Savoy dowry, and felt a surge of cold clarity. This was not a theft of coin or a diversion of oil. This was a strike at the heart of the alliance's physical utility. Without these stallions, the royal guard's mobility was crippled, and the symbolic strength of the Union was literally hobbled. He looked toward the stable entrance and saw a single crimson ribbon snagged on a splinter of wood. A calling card. "She isn't trying to bankrupt us anymore," Celilipa whispered, her voice devoid of surprise. She stepped toward one of the shivering animals, her hand hovering just inches from its velvet nose. "She is trying to make us look incompetent. If the world sees that the king cannot even secure his own stables, the council will argue that we are incapable of securing the borders." As they turned to leave the stables, Alysston noticed a group of servants whispering in a tight circle, their eyes darting toward the royal couple with a mixture of pity and fear. The contagion of doubt was spreading. The Ponsonby influence hadn't been erased by the audit. It had simply mutated. By attacking the horses, Bladevina had shifted the battlefield from the ledgers of the treasury to the optics of power. "We don't call for an investigation," Alysston decided, his voice low and dangerous. "If we start a formal inquiry now, we admit the castle has been breached. We admit we are vulnerable. Instead, we announce that the horses are undergoing a special Riendalian purification ritual to prepare them for the capital's climate. We turn a sabotage into a cultural eccentricity." "A ritual," Celilipa murmured, her eyes brightening as she caught the thread of his strategy. "Of course, we shall call it the Sovereign's Attunement *. We will tell the court that the horses are reacting to the shift in ley lines, and that only a specific, prolonged period of silence and specialized feed can ground them. We make the sabotage look like a luxury of the elite, an exotic necessity of the Savoy line." The plan worked with a precision that bordered on the theatrical. For the next 10 days, the stables were declared a sanctuary of sacred recovery, guarded by a rotating shift of Alyston's most loyal men. Inside, the royal veterinarian worked feverishly to neutralize the toxin, while outside, the court buzzed with a strange, renewed curiosity. The nobles, ever eager to be part of a trend, began to speak of the attunement in hushed, respectful tones, treating the horses' temporary insanity as a sign of their otherworldly pedigree. Bladevina had intended to create a scandal of incompetence. Instead, she had accidentally breathed a myth of mysticism into the royal stables. However, the victory was a thin veneer. While the court was distracted by the purification, Alysston found himself slipping into the lower depths of the keep, the damp stone walls weeping saltpeter. He had spent his nights not in the royal bed, but in the dusty corners of the cellar, tracing the old drainage maps of the castle. He had realized that the crimson ribbon in the stables hadn't been left by accident. It had been a lure, a way to keep him focused on the surface, while the real intrusion happened beneath. In the silence of the midnight hour, Alysston discovered a hidden door, a heavy iron grate that led to the forgotten conduits of the old world. These tunnels had once connected the royal keep to the city's outer walls, remnants of a time when kings feared their own courtiers. As he descended with a single torch, he found a small, discarded object on the floor. A small vial of the same iridescent blue slime used on the horses, along with a wax-sealed letter addressed to a contact in the borderlands. The letter didn't speak of oil or horses. It spoke of a great severing. Bladivina wasn't just playing a game of courtly influence. She was coordinating a larger movement to physically isolate the capital, cutting off the supply lines that linked Astyia to Riondal. She was weaving a web of logistics that would leave the city starving and vulnerable, all while the nobility marveled at the mystical horses. Alysston stared at the letter, the flickering torchlight casting long, jagged shadows against the damp masonry. The great severing was not a metaphor, it was a blueprint. Bladivina intended to orchestrate a series of strategic collapses, bridges sabotaged, mountain passes blocked by coordinated landslides, and harbor masters bribed into silence, effectively turning the capital into a gilded cage. By the time the council realized the city was isolated, the House of Ponsonby would be the only entity with the resources to save the crown, effectively installing themselves as the puppet masters of a starving court. He climbed back into the light of the upper keep, his mind racing. He didn't go to his generals, he went to Celilipa. She was in the solar, her fingers stained with ink as she mapped out the social hierarchy of the next month's festivities. When he dropped the letter onto her desk, her expression didn't shatter, it sharpened. "She thinks we are playing at sovereignty," Celilipa whispered, her eyes scanning the text with a surgical intensity. "She believes our strength is purely performative. She doesn't realize that while she was planning to cut our lines, we were building new ones. The borderlands are already compromised," Alysston admitted, his voice grim. "If we act openly, we alert her to the fact that we know. If we wait, the city chokes." Celilipa looked up, a spark of something predatory and brilliant in her gaze. "Then we don't act openly. We don't send armies to clear the roads. We send merchants. We don't announce a defense. We announce a trade fair. A grand, extravagant celebration of the new union, inviting the most influential merchants from the borderlands to the capital. We lure the very people she is paying to block the roads into the heart of the city, offering them rewards that far outweigh Ponsonby gold. The Union Fair was conceived not as a festival, but as a vacuum, designed to suck every opportunistic merchant and caravan driver out of the borderlands and into the capital's open arms. For 3 weeks, the city of Astyia transformed into a kaleidoscopic bazaar of Riondalian silks and Geogralian ores. Celilipa orchestrated the event with the precision of a clockmaker, offering exclusive royal charters to any trader who could successfully navigate the mountain passes to reach the city. It was a brilliant stroke of economic warfare. The promise of a royal charter was worth 10 times the bribes Bladivina had offered to keep the roads closed. As the caravans began to trickle in, the great severing stalled before it could even begin. The mercenaries and blockade runners hired by the House of Ponsonby found themselves in a predicament. They could either continue to hold a crumbling line for a woman whose gold was dwindling, or they could pivot to the king's generosity and secure a lifetime of legitimate trade. One by one, the landslides were cleared by the very men paid to cause them, and the harbor masters began to report the arrival of ships that Bladivina had assumed were sailing toward the horizon. Amidst the glitter and noise of the fair, Alastan watched from the balcony of the royal dais. He saw Bladivina standing among the crowd, her expression a mask of frozen composure, though her knuckles were white as she gripped her fan. She was witnessing the collapse of her invisible wall. Every wagon that entered the city gates was a nail in the coffin of her plan. She had played a game of shadows, but Alastan and Celilipa had countered by flooding the board with light. "She looks like a statue of salt," Julian remarked, leaning beside Alastan with a goblet of spiced wine. Quite a feat, really, to be outmaneuvered by a trade fair. The councilmen are practically swooning over your generosity, Alastan. They've forgotten all about your bloodline and are now too busy counting the new tariffs. Alastan didn't smile. He knew that while the logistical threat had been neutralized, the psychological one remained. He looked at Celilipa, who was currently enchanting a group of northern delegates with her effortless diplomacy. She caught his eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They had won the first movement of the symphony, but the music was far from over.